Hi, everyone. My name is Zach Slagle. I'm a fisheries biologist with the Sandusky Fisheries Research Unit. I work for the Ohio Division of Wildlife, and I'm responsible for our largemouth bass and smallmouth bass surveys in the West Basin of Lake Erie. Today, I want to talk to you about some interesting data that's come from one of our side projects that's revealing that smallmouth bass may be more mobile than previously understood. So in the course of this talk, I'm going to go into the background. What does the literature say on smallmouth bass movement and why do we care? I'll go into a review of the project that got us tagging bass in the first place and how we set up this project. I'll talk about some of the data that is revealing how much these fish move, and then where do we go from here? So the background, and why do we care? Who cares how much a bass moves? Well, if bass or bass population makes relatively small movements, that is, they spend their entire lives in one small area of a lake, then we might be worried about localized depletion. And what I mean by that is we have anglers going out and hitting popular sites hard, and if they're harvesting the fish, then we could have overfishing there. Or even if we have, most bass fisheries, and Lake Erie is no exception, are these days 99% catch and release. Even with that, if you think about a tournament setting, these tournament anglers can be going out, catching a bunch of fish at popular areas, and then transporting them long distances to the weigh-in site. And those fish aren't returned back typically. So we could have localized depletion and overfishing, even if we're not actually harvesting those fish. We also might be worried about genetic conservation more. If there's relatively little movement between areas that host bass populations, then there's potential for local adaptation, and we might be more worried about overfishing particular populations. Now, if fish make large movements, we are not worried about localized depletion. Those areas should be repopulated by bass relatively quickly. But these fish could be moving across management boundaries. So, they could move into other states or even other countries' waters where regulations are different, and that can be a challenge for managers. Now, as I mentioned, bass movement has received a good bit of attention in the literature. There's been many studies that were done in the 50s through the 90s. Many of these studies used external tags, so they're relying on angler tag returns or radio tracking. Now, typically these projects are done in smaller lakes relative to the Great Lakes, but typically they're finding that these fish move less than 20 kilometers through the course of the study, either over a year or over a season. And typically, they're really moving only 5 to 10 kilometers or staying within a 100-hectare area or something like that. The literature does suggest that there's more movement in rivers, in lotic systems. Smallmouth bass have been documented making migrations up to 85 kilometers. So there is potential for these fish to be moving quite a bit. And in the Great Lakes, smallmouth bass movement has gotten a little bit of attention, in particular in Lake Michigan at the Beaver Island Archipelago. Kamenk et al. Documented a couple fish. One moved 33 kilometers and one moved 59 kilometers. And Hornsby et al., or Hornsby's master's thesis out of Bruce Tufts' lab at Queen's University found that one fish of the 20 or so that they had tagged moved 135 kilometers. So really large distance. That's probably the biggest documented movement that I've seen in the literature. Now I want to focus on Lake Erie, which is one of the 5 Great Lakes. It's the second smallest. It's relatively warm and shallow compared to the rest of the Great Lakes, and it's highly productive. And I'm focusing on the west end of it, which even for this lake is warm and shallow. It supports a lot of different fisheries, perch and walleye, but smallmouth bass is also very popular. You can see there's a number of small islands, and there's a bunch of underwater reefs as well that support popular bass fisheries. Now, this is not the first time that we've tagged fish. My predecessors at the Ohio Division of Wildlife tagged about 6,000 bass in the late 90s uh, by enlisting anglers to help catch them. They also caught them via electrofishing and trap netting. These tags were external tags like you can see here. This is a jaw tag on a fish. So we're relying on anglers to be able to see those tags and then know who to call to report the catch. This project found relatively low movement for these fish. The average distance from release site to recapture site was 9.1 kilometers, and that was skewed by a handful of very long distance recaptures. So the median was actually 3.8 kilometers, so pretty low movement between tagging and capture site. And that can even be over the course of a couple years. There was a handful of fish, like I said, that moved very far distances. One that actually was recovered off of Buffalo, New York, moved more than 300 kilometers. But biologists at the time concluded that Lake Erie smallmouth bass may be many small populations rather than one intermingling population. Now on to more recent work. The project that got us tagging bass in the first place was a tournament dispersal project. So in September of 2018, out of the Ohio Bass Federation National Semifinal, we tagged a total of 23 smallmouth bass with Vemco transmitters, V13s, and then released them at the weigh-in site to determine how quickly these fish disperse. Now these fish were caught, anglers indicated that they caught them all over the Bass Islands up here. These green circles correspond to capture locations, and the size indicates how many fish were caught approximately there. You can see many of these fish were caught out of the Bass Islands or out of the Kelly's Island area. They were transported quite a ways. Average distance transported from capture location to the release site down here. This is in Sandusky, Ohio, in Sandusky Bay, but the bay is, as you can see, open to the lake. These fish were transported an average of 24 kilometers, ranging from 6 to 45 kilometers over the water. That ends up being 15-mile average transport distance. So that project has already been published in the Journal of Great Lakes Research, so go look that up if you're interested in the short-term results. In this talk, we're more interested in the long-term results. So these tags are good for 2 years, and we've collected about a year's worth of data for those fish that are still at large in the lake. The only reason we have data on these fish out in the main lake is through GLADOS. This is a Great Lakes Fisheries Commission program where researchers across institutions and state and provincial governments can share data. So we all use Vemco receivers and Vemco tags and can share data that way. So each of these blue dots corresponds to an acoustic receiver location in between 2018, 2019. And you can see there's quite a few receivers out here. But it's important to note too that this is a very large lake. This is 10 kilometers right here. So the distance in between these receivers is sometimes 12 to 15 kilometers. There's a lot of room in between these receivers for a bass to sneak through and not be detected when they're moving around. So I want to go through a couple of individual detection histories just to show where these fish have been moving around. So we had a total of 23 fish originally tagged. Of those, 4 either died or disappeared, so they were censored from the data. So we ended up having 19 living fish, and then a total of 8 fish of those 19 have been detected out on this main lake array outside of Sandusky Bay. So I'm going to show you 3 different individual detection histories just to show what these fish are capable of. This fish, so all the fish were released in Sandusky in September of 2018. This fish was at large for a while and then first detected again in May 2019 in between. This is South Bass Island, also called Put-in Bay, and Middle Bass Island. And then in June 2019, it was actually reported in by an angler on Rattlesnake Island here. So that fish ended up moving a total of 31 kilometers. It's possible that this fish actually returned to its capture site. Unfortunately, we do not have the data to assign individual capture areas with individual fish. For this fish was again released in September of 2018, detected a few months later in Canadian waters up here at the Hen and Chicks Array, and then north of this is Pelee Island right here. So this fish was perhaps overwintering up in Canadian waters, and then was at large for a few months, and then detected in September 2019, so a full year after it was released, at this is Gull Island Shoal. This was on a acoustic receiver that was attached to a gill net. That fish ended up moving a total of 71 kilometers, a minimum of 71 kilometers over the course of a year. And I say minimum because these are just, this fish was at large for a while and then detected here, at large again, and then detected here. So we don't know what happened in between. This last fish, individual fish that I want to show you, this is the big mover of the study. So this fish, again, released in September, detected up here at the Hen and Chicks in December. In April, it was detected north of there. And then in May of 2019, it started making moves. Moved a little bit south. Then again in May was detected way down here. This is in Ohio waters. This is the West Basin Reef Complex off of Davis-Besse Power Plant. And then again in May 2019 was in between South and Middle Bass Islands here. That fish ended up moving a total of 92 kilometers in less than a year. So these fish are capable of making some pretty broad movements in a habitat like the Great Lakes. Now, I'm going to show you an animation of all 8 of the fish that have been detected. You can see up in the top left, there's the month of the year, and all these fish are being released down here in Sandusky. So you can kind of get a sense for how quickly these fish are moving out, and then as we get into wintertime here, you see that there's a movement up into the Hen and Chicks Array or north of Pelee in Canadian waters. So there's some suggestion that maybe these fish are overwintering up here. And then as we get into warmer water, April and then May, we see some pretty rapid movements over here to these West Basin reefs. These are potentially suggestive of fish making spawning movements. And as these dots disappear, it just means that we haven't detected these fish since then. So that's all the data that I have to show you. Where do we go from here? Now, obviously, we need more data. These fish, these tags are still good for another year. So we haven't downloaded those acoustic receivers. We normally do our acoustic receiver maintenance in August or September. So very soon we should be getting more data, and hopefully we'll have some more detections on those fish. And we'd like to do some future tagging projects. We don't have anything planned right now because we don't have funding. But of course, the data that I'm presenting today are just, almost anecdotal because we have so few tags. It's a small sample. There's only 8 fish out there, and they're biased in 2 important ways. These fish were selected by, being caught, being angled by anglers. And we know from Dave Phillip and Steve Cook's work, among others, that these fish are going to be the more aggressive fish, the higher metabolism fish, just because they're susceptible to angling. And that could mean that they want to move more. We also know that we transported these fish over long distances, from their capture sites to the weigh-in sites, and that could induce them to move quite a bit more than your typical fish. Remaining questions for the smallmouth bass population: how much of the population makes these long movements, and do they make those long movements if they're not transported by anglers? Does smallmouth bass range change seasonally? There's some suggestion that maybe it does, but we obviously need more greater sample size. And do smallmouth bass return to spawning sites in Lake Erie year after year like they do in other systems? With that, I need to thank Steve Coulter, Bud Graham, the Ohio Bass Federation. Those guys have been great. They let me tag fish out of their tournament and have been highly interested in the results of that tagging. Um, Sport Fish Restoration Program provided funding, and a number of collaborators, both within the Division of Wildlife at USGS and others, helped out with this work. Here's a few of the papers that I referenced, and please let me know what you think. If you have any comments, criticism, concerns, please hit me up, especially on email or Twitter. Thanks a lot, and appreciate your attention.